The animals looked at the humans and then back to the pigs, and then back to the humans and back to the pigs, and they could no longer tell which was which. Quite possibly the best closing line of any book in history, and it hits home because at the start of this country, there was a little thing called the Boston Tea Party where there were a lot of people who were very upset about something as little as, I think it was like close to a 3% tax, and in the Constitution, the drafting of the Constitution was written in a way that it should have been illegal for income taxes to ever hit the American citizen. However, we are sitting at a place right now where the federal government just got a monster raise. So much so, in fact, that in April, the amount of money that the federal government made, while most Americans are losing money each month due to inflation, their wages are not rising at keeping at pace with inflation. It's harder and harder to keep up with the cost of living. Meanwhile, the federal government just got a raise that was to the extent that it made every other yearly peak in income the federal government has ever received, dwarfed it by about double. So we are going to dive into exactly how this happened, and it will show why the government will always prefer inflationary monetary policy over deflationary monetary policy when it has the choice. Ready? Let's dive in. All right, let's look at the headline and then we're going to dive into some of the charts. Take a look here. The U.S. Treasury reports record budget surplus in April as revenues soar. So we can take a look here and see that the government posted a $308 billion surplus in April, which is a record we're going to see here in a moment. It was not just a little record, just a monstrous record here. The receipts nearly doubled from a year earlier due to a couple of things going on. Now, because of this higher income and because of less spending, we can see here that for the first 7 months of the 22 fiscal year, the government reported a $360 billion deficit, which was down 81% from the year earlier. This has been the lowest deficit for the first 7 months of fiscal year since 2017. So what is going on here? It is not because of a lack of trying. In fact, the administration in power has been trying since it got in to spend more and more and more, but because of political gridlock, they have not been able to spend near as much as they have wanted. That has led to increasing incomes and decreasing expenditures. If we take a look at this deficit tracker from bipartisanpolicy.org, we can take a look at the cumulative chart here of deficits by year. So 2019 is going to be this bright blue one. We can see just chugging along kind of like normal compared to the other years. Green was 2020, so we can see in March, obviously massive deficit from March to April, and climbed really quickly until about June there. In 2021, it looks a lot closer to the chart of 2019 in terms of its the amount that it increases by each month. And then 2022, where we're at right now, this was the only month where we had such a drastic drop from March to April in terms of the deficit. So much so, and this is cumulative here, so it doesn't go under zero. This is a cumulative deficit tracker. So we can see here that shows a surplus, $308 billion surplus. And that's really interesting considering that May 1st fell on a weekend. So some of the expenses fell into April that normally would have happened in May. And so if it weren't for that, just, random occurrence from the way that the calendar showed up this year, then the April surplus would have been even larger at $373 billion. The deficit for last year would have been $166 billion. So again, not for lack of trying, but the federal government has not been spending near as much money as they wanted to. So what does this look like? Let's take a look at the charts now, at the graphs, to see exactly how different it is right now versus years past. First thing we're going to look at is the total federal receipts. This is just the perfect way to see what's going on right now. So we're going back here to 1975 or 1980 here. Yeah, 1980. we can see every single every single month what the federal government is bringing in. We can see that it fluctuates, and each one of these spikes that you see here, these spikes that happen every year, that's the tax month. That's April. That's when everybody pays their taxes. So as we zoom in here, we see that the federal government has been making more and more and more money as time has gone on, right? As you would expect. And so they've been making more and more and more. And then we zoom in here and we can see in July of 2020, this was a monstrous year. Now, that was a monstrous year, but we have to keep in mind that was July. Normally, taxes come in April. So there were some additional funds that hadn't been paid because everybody got the extension to not have to pay until later. So you'd expect a little bit of a boost there versus April of 2019. Now, what was masked here, and I made a video about this last year, was the income that the federal government got during tax time during 2021, because there was also an available extension, but not everybody took advantage of it. And so we saw a lot of money come in April, May, and June that normally would have come in during the same month. And so altogether, a lot of this money that came in split up over these 3 months would have normally come in during April. Not all of it, but a lot of it, showing a much larger 1 month of federal tax income. However, that didn't happen, so we were left waiting for this year. And this year, we had the normal tax deadlines, and we saw it all come in during the same month, and it makes everything that happened before, it dwarfs it. Unbelievable here. 863,000 million. So that's $863 billion in 1 month, basically double what it normally brings in during the peaks, during the tax months. Now, did your income double this year versus last year? Most likely not. In fact, most Americans, their wages are increasing, but inflation is increasing faster. So the cost of goods is rising by, let's say, 8%. Most people got a raise of 5%. So you're getting more money, but it's not going as far. So in real terms, people are getting pay cuts. Meanwhile, the federal government, who doesn't provide value, who doesn't create wealth, who just transfers and takes and scalps wealth out of the system, got the biggest raise in history. Now let's look at the Treasury General Account. You can think of this like the federal government's checking account. You can see here that when the federal government borrowed a bunch in order to start spending to deal with the pandemic, this Treasury General Account, it's spiked up to about $1.8 trillion here. And when Biden got into office, Yellen said, hey, we're not going to borrow as much. We're going to spend this account down. And they started spending it down. And the plan was to stop at around $400 billion. But they couldn't get the budget passed. They couldn't get the spending, the debt ceiling raised. They kept on running into those issues. So they spent this down a lot further than they were planning on originally. And then since then, they've solved those issues. This account has been blowing up, and it blew up recently here, obviously, because they got a monster paycheck. So this is the account that all the money that the federal government goes into, whether they get it from taxes or borrowing. And then this is the account where they spend all the money out of when they spend money on anything that they spend money on. And it's been increasing because despite the fact that they've had a massive amount of money coming in, they have not been spending as much money, keeping pace with what they've been bringing in. And so their spending has been largely in line with what it was historically. If we take this back here, you can plot like a little, just visualize a little trend here. Yes, it's been increasing for the last 5 years on average, even if we exclude these spikes from COVID, but it has not increased to the extent that their income has increased. And so because their income has increased, but their expenses haven't kept pace, you've seen this account start to blow back up, reaching almost $1 trillion again. This led to a decline in the federal debt, the national debt in quarter 3 of 2021 last year, you actually saw for a quarter the national debt declined because they weren't borrowing as much because they didn't have as much spending they needed to cover in excess of the taxes that they were bringing in. Now, there is one category of expenses that the federal government had an increase in that is worthy to note here. If we take a look back at this article that we looked at earlier from Reuters, we can see the Treasury's interest costs climbed 32% to $60 billion just last month, and they rose 28% to $350 billion in the year-to-date period. This was a result of compensation paid to holders of TIPS. These are Treasury inflation-protected securities, which are indexed to the CPI. And so because inflation has been taking off, you don't just have to pay attention to the 30-year, the 20-year, the 10-year, the 2-year, and try and see, hey, as the government rolls over their old low interest debt to this new higher interest debt, how much of their money is going to have to go towards paying expenses, because they also have some debt that is adjustable rate debt. It's inflation protected, the TIPS, Treasury inflation protected securities. And as the CPI stays at 6%, 7%, 8%, potentially higher in coming months, they will continue to have to pay out higher and higher interest expenses on this debt. It is not good for the federal government. That increases their expenses just from inflation without them even having to roll over old debt into new debt with the higher interest rate on it. But that is a very small sum compared to everything else that they have going on, which highlights why the government will always prefer an inflationary monetary and fiscal policy over a deflationary one. We saw in the last quarter of last year, the national debt declined. Now, they've since made it up, obviously, but it did decline because when you make more income compared to your expenses and you pay off debt, or even if you don't pay off the debt, if your income goes up drastically compared to your debt service costs, then that debt service cost doesn't matter to you anymore. If, let's say, the federal government debt stays at around $30 trillion, but they could increase their income to $30 trillion a year, they wouldn't care about the national debt anymore. It would be absolutely nothing, equal to 1 year's worth of income. The way that you do that is by having an inflationary monetary and fiscal policy. You spend a bunch of money into the economy. You spend that money into existence. It can't be a transfer payment. You can't tax it out and then spend it. You have to spend it by borrowing, and this is key, have that borrowing, that debt purchased by the money printer, the central bank, the Federal Reserve. So they print the money, they buy the debt, so that money that the federal government is spending is being spent into existence. That increases the amount of money in the system, that bids up prices. As that money works its way throughout the system, every single transaction along the way gets taxed. Every buy, every sell, all the labor, everything gets taxed. So as that money enters the economy, it starts to come back to the federal government from taxes. Not only that, but it bids up the prices of goods and services and assets. Well, what happens when prices go up? The nominal amount of taxes increases as well. Your taxable capital gains sales. When you sell something at a gain, you pay taxes on it. So if the government wants to make more taxes, all they have to do is make prices go up, and then when things get sold, now there are some gains that they get to tax. And not only does that impact capital gains, it also impacts wages, because if your salary goes from $100,000 to $110,000, they don't care if your cost of living went up to $110,000 as well. They just got an extra $10,000 they got to tax. And if that bumped you up with those dollars into a higher tax bracket, they get to tax those dollars at a higher rate as well. It's a win-win-win for the government. Regardless of what it does to your cost of living, they want an inflationary monetary policy because it makes the real cost of servicing their debt easier. As they spend money into existence, they get more money back in taxes without having to increase the tax rates. And if they are able to increase the tax rates, that just makes things all the better. That's a cherry on top. So now you understand why the government will always prefer an inflationary monetary policy, especially if they have a lot of debt, because it makes it easier to erase that debt. print a bunch of money, spend it into the economy, watch it come back in taxes, you wipe out your own debt. And that is how the government gave themselves the largest raise in the history of our government's existence, receiving $863 billion in just 1 month. And here's to hoping they put it to good use. As always, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.